After the overwhelming success of Resident Evil 7, the team at Capcom got to work on a sequel pretty much immediately. Initial concepts for the game would actually start a few months before RE7 even released, and at that time, they were thinking that they would play it safe and stick to the same traditional survival horror design that RE7 had used. But after its release was so successful, the team had a newfound confidence and decided to get a bit more adventurous with it. They would keep the general design of Resident Evil 7 and use that as a base for the project, but it was also decided that they would bring back a lot of what made Resident Evil 4 such a hit among fans more than a decade prior. As the game's director Morimasa Sato put it, we're bringing the essence of Resident Evil 4 while Resident Evil 7 functions as a base for the game. During these early stages, the team landed on having an area like the village from the first third of RE4, but wanted to take that even further and make the village a central location throughout the entire game. It was also planned that instead of shifting to another protagonist for this title like they had initially planned to, they would instead bring back Ethan Winters as the main character for this game, as fans and members of the development team alike had grown pretty attached to him after Resident Evil 7. And from here, development would go shockingly smoothly aside from a brief halt in early 2020 due to the COVID pandemic. And in June of that same year, we would see the reveal of Resident Evil Village. Fans all over the world immediately got hyped up for the return of Ethan Winters, the awesome new setting, and, of course, the return of Chris Redfield that was revealed as well. And after a pretty short wait, we would finally get our hands on Resident Evil Village in May of 2021. The question is though, did all of these bold decisions end up making a strong Resident Evil game, or did the team get a bit overconfident and carried away? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 29th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but I would highly recommend that you've seen my videos on both Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, as those games are very important to understanding the design of Village, and I'm going to be referencing them a lot throughout the video. So for those of you who are interested in checking out those, or just the rest of the series first, I'll have the full series playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil Village is a survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, and PC in 2021. The game takes place a little over 3 years after the events of Resident Evil 7, and sees us stepping into the shoes of Ethan Winters once again. In the years since the Dulvey incident, Chris Redfield made sure to relocate Ethan and his wife Mia to a quiet countryside somewhere in Europe. He also ensured that they received as much weapons and combat training as civilians really could in order to just ensure their personal safety. The two of them also had a daughter in that time named Rosemary, who they now hope that they can just live a quiet life with and move on from everything that happened a few years ago. One night, though, their peaceful life is suddenly interrupted by an unexpected raid from Chris Redfield and his Hound Wolf squad, in which they fire at Mia through the windows before Chris himself enters the home and swiftly mag dumps into her to make sure that she doesn't survive. Ethan is of course in shock after this, not knowing why they would do such a thing, but before he can even really ask what's going on, Chris's squad kidnap both him and Rose, loading them into a vehicle for transport. A few hours later, Ethan wakes up in the middle of the woods just outside of a wrecked vehicle, finding that Chris's squadmates are dead and Rose is nowhere to be seen. He manages to pull himself from the wreck and walk down the path through the woods, eventually coming to a remote village where he hopes that he can find some help. But seeing as this is a Resident Evil game, I'm sure you can imagine that help is the absolute last thing that he found here. He quickly finds himself scrambling with some of the locals, trying to fight off large groups of what can only be described as highly aggressive wolf men. Things spiral out of control quite a bit from here, and while I won't be spoiling most of it in this video, we will cover some more story content throughout the video as it comes up. Talking a bit more about the game itself though, I have to start by saying that Resident Evil Village is a beautiful looking game. The RE engine has been put to even better use here than we've seen from any of the other games so far, and aside from some pretty muddy or low quality textures in certain spots, pretty much every weird quirk of the engine has been resolved now. What I appreciate most about Village's visuals, though, is that the art direction here is nothing short of phenomenal. The game leans very heavily into a gothic horror aesthetic, and pretty much every environment in the game, from the village itself to the castle on the hill, and especially the factory near the end of the game, are all breathtaking from an artistic standpoint. And of course, the sound design is also just top-notch here, pretty much like it's been in every RE game since 7. So overall, the presentation is fantastic in this game, and makes for a world that's incredibly easy to get pulled into and lost in. Getting into the gameplay itself though, Village takes the action horror formula of RE4 and seamlessly blends it with the survival horror design of RE7 in a way that feels shockingly natural and just really awesome for longtime fans like myself. It's like seeing the two best formulas the series has had over the years come together and make something that feels familiar, yet totally fresh at the same time. We fight tons of enemies, have a vendor that can upgrade our weapons throughout the game using the money we gather, and all of the addictive progression and gameplay that comes with that. But we also have the slower pace, the limited supplies, and the level design and progression from the survival horror entries. And of course, we're still in first person, as that was kind of just the natural choice when making a game to follow up the success of Resident Evil 7. And seriously, it sounds like such a weird combination, but it just works. That classic Resi level design with elaborate areas that are slowly opened up and tons of puzzles to solve works shockingly well when you add in some RE4 inspired combat encounters and leave a bunch of extra hidden treasure items scattered around to even further encourage thorough exploration. And yeah, the treasure items from RE4 are back here, with these still just being items that can be found by spotting a little glimmer in the environment or solving a completely optional puzzle that can then be sold to the game's vendor for a bunch of extra cash that you can use on weapons and upgrades. They're a great fit in the more survival horror style level design here, since you're already scavenging and desperately searching for items everywhere anyway, so sprinkling in some little items that just give you a bunch of cash for extra upgrades feels really good, and I'm super glad that they brought them back for this game. They work especially well considering that they also brought back the map system from the remakes, meaning that you can check your map to see if you've totally cleared out an area before moving on for the first time in a mainline title, which sounds kind of weird to say out loud, but it's true. This is the first Resident Evil game outside of the remakes to actually have this incredible map system, which is obviously a huge win. The only complaint I really have is that it includes treasure items as part of that completion criteria, which sounds like a no-brainer, but it does mean that if you're like me and try to clear out absolutely everything before moving on to the next area, you will likely spend forever going around looking for that one hidden treasure item in there that you just can't seem to find. But then again, having a system that makes it very easy for you to make sure you're getting all of the treasure and maximizing your upgrades is obviously a positive of its own, so the annoyance that does come from it is at least coming from a pretty good thing. Now, the general structure of the game is also just an awesome blend of the two styles. You'll start out in that village that Ethan finds just after waking up from the crash, and this acts more like a traditional survival horror RE map, with a ton of locked doors, optional puzzles, and new routes, areas, and shortcuts that open up with key items as you progress. You'll slowly explore the village, find all sorts of items that allow you to do new things or progress to new areas, and on occasion, these new routes of progression will actually take you outside of the village, which is where things get really interesting. This is because every time you leave the village, you'll be blocked from going back to it for a time and forced to continue through this new area that you've just opened up. And these main areas are much more linear, combat-heavy affairs that feel very similar to the stages of Resident Evil 4. Each of the main areas are also totally distinct from one another in their aesthetics and theme, as they're all the domains of their own respective antagonists that Ethan has to take down. So each area ends up reflecting the theme of the antagonist that inhabits it. The first area of the game is a classic gothic castle that belongs to Lady Dimitrescu, a villain who's very much inspired by gothic vampire legend. After this though, you'll go to a house up on a distant mountain that feels incredibly reminiscent of gothic ghost legends, with a villain who induces hallucinations and controls dolls with her mind to boot. Then you'll be taken to the water reservoir with a villain who's inspired by gothic mermen, and my personal favorite from a visual standpoint, the factory near the end of the game that pulls from gothic themes of simulacra. Now, I do have to say that the antagonists of this game are hands down the biggest bunch of goofballs that we've seen from the entire series, which is absolutely saying something when you're comparing to games like Resident Evil 4 or 5. And if you've ever seen my videos on those games, you would know that I tend to have a hard time taking villains like this seriously, and having them be inspired by various gothic monsters definitely doesn't help with that. Fortunately though, there is an explanation for each and every one of them and how they came to be the way that they are, and they're all based in science and experimentation just like we'd expect from a Resident Evil game. But in spite of that, they're still pretty out there and fairly wacky. The best part of this general formula, though, is that when you visit each of these main areas, Ethan will end up acquiring 1 or 2 new key items as he moves through them. And after you've dealt with the villain of that area, you'll return to the village and have a whole bunch of new stuff to explore and open up within it, thanks to those new items that you've acquired. And beyond that, the village will also change a bit every time you go back to it, leading to even more discovery, even within areas of it that you've already seen. My personal favorite of these is that every time you return, you'll be able to find a new sign of Chris and his squad's presence within the village, which just gives you these little extra breadcrumbs leading up to Ethan's eventual confrontation with them for players who take the time to thoroughly explore every time they go back. So even in terms of the game's structure and level design, you end up bouncing back and forth between that classic survival horror style and RE4's action horror style in a way that just works really well. And since you're bouncing back and forth between them every hour or so, the pacing in this game is just immaculate since you're never really doing the same thing for very long. And speaking of things from RE4, the game's inventory is actually basically the exact same as Resident Evil 4's. You have a large grid-based case that allows you to shuffle things around and organize as you please, and things like key items and treasure items even go into separate menus that don't take up your main inventory space. I will say that micromanaging and organizing my inventory has never really felt necessary in Village due to the fact that you'll almost always be low on resources since the game is still trying to be a bit more survival horror than action horror, but I at least appreciate that they brought back what was easily one of the best parts of RE4 for what is essentially its spiritual successor. And while I didn't do any New Game Plus runs for this video, I do vaguely remember from playing the game a ton on launch that things like inventory management become a lot more important in those runs due to you just having more items built up. Something that fits surprisingly well with this inventory system is the crafting system from Resident Evil 7 being pulled over here. This crafting system has its own dedicated tab in the inventory just like it did in 7, but it's also been expanded and improved upon a good bit here. There are way more crafting recipes that you can learn throughout the course of the game, thus allowing you to make more items through the crafting system than you ever could before, and thankfully, we don't have a repeat of RE7's system where every single item you crafted required chem fluid. Here in Village, there are way more unique combinations of 2 or even sometimes 3 items that you require to make an item, meaning that you no longer have to carefully ration out one resource that will be required for every single craftable in the game. This opens the system up a lot more, But having more recipes still means that certain crafting components might be better used for something else, so it doesn't disrupt that balance of saving items for other recipes, even though you might be able to make something with them right now. It's a great evolution of the system, and while I still prefer the more traditional gunpowder system of RE3 or the 2 and 3 remakes, this is a take on RE7's crafting system that I actually really enjoy. And of course, we couldn't have a successor to Resident Evil 4 without an incredibly charming merchant. So, Village introduces us to the Duke. The Duke is a shockingly large man with a shockingly large assortment of goods. But of course, the ones that we're really interested in are his weapons and the upgrades for them that he provides. With these, of course, allowing the player to find different types of weapons that might better suit a specific playstyle and find what they really enjoy, then just pump a ton of upgrades into it to make it even better. He mysteriously pops up pretty much everywhere Ethan goes, just like the original merchant from RE4, and also has a ton of charisma just like him. Well, not quite as much charisma, but that's some pretty stiff competition, and I think he does pretty well.
What are you buying? Just something an old friend of mine used to say.
Okay, no, I take it back. He's just as good. That being said though, I do have a pretty big issue with his implementation. That being that the pacing of upgrades in this game is pretty awful. By that, I mean that the points in the game at which they increase the amount of upgrades available to the player are very poorly spaced out. The game uses a 5-bar system, with 1 bar being the default value that a weapon starts with, and 5 bars being when the weapon is totally maxed out. At the start of the game, you'll only be able to purchase 1 upgrade per category on your weapons, allowing you to go from 1 bar to 2 bars, and this will remain the case until you're about a quarter of the way into the game, at which point the limit raises from 2 bars to 3 bars. You will then stay at this upgrade cap for the next roughly half of the game, with you not being able to purchase 4 bars of upgrades until you reach about the last quarter of the game. And even then, you still won't be able to achieve the maximum upgrades on your weapons until right before the finale of the game. And by right before the finale, I mean that you don't get access to the 5-bar upgrades until literally right before the final boss of the game. Meaning that you can only even possibly see your favorite weapon at its maximum potential either in the game's final boss fight, or more realistically, just in a New Game Plus playthrough. This led to plenty of times during my recent playthrough where I would reach the upgrade cap for all the weapons that I was using at that point, and then since I was hunting for every treasure item in the game, I would continue to stockpile currency through my exploration that I couldn't even do anything with until much later in the game. It's just really poorly paced in my opinion, and absolutely removes that magic that RE4 had of finding a weapon that you really like, and then working to max it out so that you can see what it's truly capable of. However, the most interesting thing about the Duke is that he also introduces an entirely new system to the franchise. The cooking system? Yes, you heard that right. We have cooking in Resident Evil now. As you explore the village between major areas, you'll be able to find animals like chickens, pigs, fish, etc., and hunt them. You can then pick up their meat and bring it back to the Duke, and he'll help you prepare a meal with what you brought him. The interesting thing about these meals, though, is that they offer a form of permanent progression for the player, primarily in the form of increasing Ethan's maximum health and reducing the damage received while guarding. There are even a handful of totally unique animals that will only spawn once in the entire game, that if you find them and bring their meat back to the Duke, can make some especially amazing upgrades. So if you go out of your way to really explore the village every time you come back from a major area, you can use these meals to become an absolute tank by the end of the game. And I don't even have to tell those of you who have watched a good bit of my channel before, but giving players a major reward for taking extra time to explore the world you've created is one of my favorite things that a developer can do. So I naturally absolutely love the introduction of this system here in Village. even though, admittedly, this is probably a system that we will never see return, as it's just so thematically tied to the village itself. Now, interestingly, we come to one of the biggest mixed bags of Resident Evil Village, or actually what I would just say is the biggest mixed bag, that being the combat. Now, there's a lot of good here for sure, like how awesome it is that you can see and feel Ethan's combat training through his new animations, and the fact that he now clearly understands how to use a firearm properly, rather than just kind of fumbling around with them like he did in 7. He's also been given a new push move that can be activated after blocking an attack, that allows him to shove enemies back and create some space, which, believe me, really helps to solve the awkward spacing problems that RE7's first-person combat had. But that being said, this game leans pretty heavily into the action horror formula, and by that metric, the combat here just feels a bit flat compared to a lot of other games in the series. This is primarily because Ethan doesn't have any sort of advanced combat techniques like those that we saw from Leon or Chris in the prior games. And this of course makes sense, as he was simply trained for self-defense, not tactical combat. But as a result of this, there isn't any sort of more advanced gameplay loop, like stunning an enemy to open them up for a melee attack that can be used for crowd control. You kind of just slowly walk backward while trying to shoot the enemies before they can get to you in this game. In this way, it weirdly still feels a lot like Resident Evil 7 when it comes to the combat, and this is likely intentional given that they were trying to keep a lot of that survival horror design as a base for Village's gameplay. But this kind of combat just doesn't really work when you're trying to make combat a main selling point of the game. The fixed camera games, RE7, and the 2 and 3 remakes having simpler combat works because combat isn't a focal point in those games. It's just one small piece of the overall experience. But for a lot of Village's runtime, combat is the primary thing that you'll be engaging with, and it just feels, like I said, a bit flat in that environment. It's actually pretty much exactly like what I said in my RE7 video about the salt mine section at the end of the game. It just feels a bit at odds with itself because it's an RE4 style combat gauntlet, but without the engaging combat mechanics that made RE4 so fun in the first place. Now, that being said, the enemy variety in this game is absolutely awesome, fixing one of the biggest issues that fans had with Resident Evil 7. You've got the Lycans that you'll primarily fight within the village itself, Morowaika in the castle, who were human women who had their blood drained for the vampires of the castle to consume, the Soldat experiments of the factory and all their different variations, flying enemies, giants with hammers, ancient werewolves, just all sorts of enemies that are not only meaningfully different from a gameplay standpoint, but who also fit the environments that you'll find them in and feel thematically appropriate. So while the combat mechanics themselves are much simpler than I would like for a more action-oriented title, the enemy variety is fantastic, and Capcom did a great job addressing this major criticism from the prior title. Now, I also have some smaller points on the combat to talk about here, with the first of these being that they've gotten rid of that awful blood overlay from RE7 and replaced it with a more subtle red vignette that pulses, making it a little less subtle. I mean, it is at least as subtle as a pulsing red outline on your screen really could be. I'm not sure if we really needed this, because they've also now added the HUD widget from the 2 and 3 remakes that displays your health on screen every time you take damage, so realistically, we could just do away with effects like these entirely at this point, since you're literally updating it on screen every time damage is taken, but at the very least, I'll take this vignette over the giant blood smear on my screen any day. And while we're on the topic of the HUD, I love that similar to all the other RE Engine titles, the HUD is so minimal here in Village that it's often just not even present whatsoever, making for an incredibly clean look. That is, until you actually use your gun or interact with certain things in the environment, in which case a reticle will appear on your screen that will not disappear under any circumstance. I'm dead serious, by the way. You'd think that this reticle would appear and then fade out after a few seconds of not using your weapon, but it just never goes away. The only ways to get it off of your screen once it's there is to pause the game, open up a similar menu like the inventory or the map screen, or just interact with something that causes Ethan to fully stow his weapon for a few seconds. I really have no idea why this reticle doesn't disappear on its own after a few seconds. It drove me crazy when the game first came out a few years ago, to the point where I had actually assumed that it was a bug that they would just patch out with time. But here we are nearly 5 years later, and it still drives me crazy, because the game just looks so damn good when you don't have this big reticle in the center of the screen disrupting your immersion. And this last one might actually be my biggest issue with the combat itself, but good lord above, this game puts these tutorial prompts on screen constantly for every little action, and it is unbelievably obnoxious. These are enabled by default and will constantly remind you how to do things like reload your weapon, shove the enemies after they attack you, and even just craft ammo anytime you have less than a magazine's worth of rounds left. And you'd think that these are just occasional tutorial messages, but seriously, they are constant and will keep popping up for the entirety of your playthrough. You'll even still be seeing them in the final boss fight. They're incredibly annoying, so for your own sake, just remember to turn them off the next time you go to play Village. Overall though, I really enjoy Resident Evil Village. It's an awesome fusion of the survival horror and action horror styles of Resident Evil that's set in one of the most unique and artistically rich settings that we've ever seen from the franchise. And while I think it's a great successor to Resident Evil 4, I wouldn't say that it quite reaches those heights, ironically, due to the survival horror design holding it back in a number of ways. The slower pace and the more thorough exploration work beautifully with this formula, but I can't help but feel like things like the weapon upgrade systems and the replayability of the game are actually hurt by them. So even though the slower survival horror entries are generally what I prefer from this series, and I think that the fusion they went for here is really cool, I also feel like this easily could have been the best action horror game in the franchise if a lot of those elements weren't there. But don't get me wrong, I love this game for what it is. The setting, the gameplay, the art direction, and especially the designs of the bioweapons that we see here and the backstory for how they came to be are just awesome. And as someone who loves both Ethan Winters and Chris Redfield, their stories here have never failed to captivate me every single time I revisit the game. So whether you're a fan of the wackier styles of Resident Evil 4 or 5, or if you're someone who prefers the older games and never quite got into them, I could easily recommend that you check out Resident Evil Village, as you'll either get more of what you love, or maybe even just fall in love with that style for the very first time. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil Village an 8.4 out of 10. That's going to wrap up this video, but do be sure to check out my other Resident Evil videos if you haven't already. Or, if you're looking to branch out a bit today, maybe check out the series that I did a while back where I played every Ace Combat game for the first time. And before you go, since we're getting so close to being done with the Resident Evil series, I have a poll in the pinned comments down below to vote for the next series that we do. So if you're at all interested in what we cover on the channel next, definitely make sure to go and check that out before you leave. Thank you for watching the video, and a very special thank you to our channel members and patrons who make series like this one possible. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, and especially a comment to help me out with the algorithm. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.